So without further ado, gives me great pleasure to welcome our panel. We have Augustin, who started off as a lawyer, but we forgive him for that. So, you know, he's got back on the right path, holds an impressive number of titles as General Secretary of Motier Holdings, which means also Executive Chairman of Citinove and Motier Domains.
We don't care. The most important thing is that we are owner of Bordeaux and Petit Village. The rest is not compulsory. Sorry about that.
Perfect.
Right, thank you so much.
Perfect. Petit Village came into the group's holdings in 2020 from AXA Millésime, and I think I can safely say has really started to make waves since the acquisition. It's a name which we're going to hear a lot more about. Beauregard too is certainly a Pomerol of no mean stature, but Petit Village, I think it's fair to say, is turning a corner and is definitely one of our estates to watch. So Augustin, thank you so much for joining us. Then gives me great pleasure to welcome a relatively recent, but I'd like to think increasingly firm friend, Tracy Dobbin, MW, who I've had the great pleasure of meeting on 2 occasions in recent months, including just last month at a fantastic 20 vintage vertical of Du Cru Beaucaillou, which she presided over with great aplomb, together with owner Eugene Bory in London. Tracy is a master of wine, a wine educator, and since 2011 has been based in Bordeaux and has been looking after markets and special advisor for wine to Du Cru Beaucaillou in Saint-Julien. Tracy, very nice to have you with us. Thank you very much.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you.
It's also a great pleasure to welcome Fabien, General Manager of Smith Haut Lafitte. Fabien, who began his winemaking career after graduating from Rennes and Montpellier with Canon Lagaffellière, another estate which is very much in the news at the moment, is really doing very well, has been at Smith Haut Lafitte for a number of years, since the mid-90s, and has become subsequently technical director of the estate, and since 2016, the general manager of Smith Haut Lafitte. And also, I noted you are now in charge of the winemaking at Daniel and Florence's interesting new project, Catia, in Napa, from the 2020 vintage. So quite a challenging year there, I imagine you had in 2020. Baptism of fire, for sure. Fabien, it's very nice to have you with us. Thank you.
Pleasure to be with you.
Merci. Last and definitely least, I sort of say that every year, Gavin, so don't pretend you're not used to it. It's a great pleasure to welcome our good friend Gavin Quinney back to our panel. Gavin is not only the owner and winemaker at Château Bordeaux, which I'm sure many of you know, and if you don't, you really should. It's a tremendous value Bordeaux, shows exactly how good the quality of wines can be at a not outrageous price. Gavin has, for a number of years, also been very prevalent on the scene in terms of providing excellent detailed reports for Jancis Robinson and for Livex and for Harper's as well. So he really is sort of a man on the ground, a great generalist. I think what Gavin doesn't know about the weather in Bordeaux isn't worth knowing. He's definitely Bordeaux's very own Michael Fish, and an enthusiastic dancer when the occasion demands. So Gavin, it's very nice to welcome you back. We also have Rebecca, who I don't think many of you will have had a chance to meet. Rebecca is one of our buyers with specific responsibility for En Primeur, and has just come back for a week in Bordeaux for the En Primeur tastings, so has tasted extensively and is going to give us a good overview of the vintage. So once again, thank you all to our illustrious panel, and thank you all to our attendees. We'll rattle on now. I have a series of questions to address some of the main points about the vintage, but please, as I said, any comments that you have or questions, please use that chat function, and I will certainly do my best to weave them into the conversation, and any lengthier questions we'll save to the end. So my first question to the panel were, what were the major challenges and successes of the vintage? So perhaps if we could start with you, Tracy, from Du Cru Beaucailloux perspective, a quick sort of précis of those two areas, please.
Sure. Well, I think obviously the heat and drought conditions of the vintage was the main challenge, though. We stressed more about it than apparently the vines did, and we'll dig deeper into that, I'm sure, with the panel discussion to understand why that is. But that is obviously the main challenge. But despite the heat and drought, we also had some spring frost. We had also the threat of mildew and botrytis after the rains in June. Those are, and we had some pretty intense hailstorms. So we had a little bit of all of the nightmares that one would have in a vineyard. We did have to face. Of course, in terms of on the left bank, we really did see in the privileged terroirs had to cope with the challenges. We're less the French word embêté, but we didn't have the same degree of strikes against us with those challenges as the lesser terroirs. In terms of the biggest successes of the vintage, obviously, I think that's what we taste in the glass, and I think that's something that we'll talk about further. But I think overall, we have, from a very hot and dry vintage. Remember, all great Bordeaux vintages are hot and dry, but yielding from this hot, dry vintage, we have a wine with great purity, with alcohol levels that are reasonable, and with a great degree of freshness in the glass. So I think that is the success.
Thank you, Tracy. Absolutely. And I suppose I would direct the same question to you, Fabien. So heading a little bit further south down to Pessac. Similar challenges, better, worse? What are your thoughts?
Yes, it was more or less the same challenges because the weather was very dry and warm, and it's certainly the warmer and drier year we never get in Bordeaux. So we have this big challenge. Frost and hail was not for us a big problem. We are lucky for that, but we are ready to manage this change of temperatures. And you spoke just before about Catia Vineyard in Napa, and I told to some people that I come back in June, I have the feeling to stay in Napa, even if I'm well in Bordeaux. So the challenge was really to manage that, and thanks to the vines, thanks to different adaptations, perhaps we will speak about that later, we were able to manage that. And the very good surprise and the very good result is the quality of the vintage. We didn't know that we could make this kind of wine, this kind of balanced wine, last year in August. We didn't know what could happen in August, and in fact, when we began to taste the grapes, we feel the freshness, the balance in the grapes, and after we thought about that and we tried to explain that. But I think, to my mind, that the drought was perhaps more impactful. We have more impact on the quality of the grapes compared to the warmness. So it was something new because we didn't know that, we didn't expect that, but it was really the good surprise, and the good success is really, as Tracy said, the balance of the wine, the freshness of the wine, and a lovely harmony. And so it's really, we could very success this year with the balance in the wine.
Thank you, Fabien. And Augustin, obviously it sounds like it was a promising, if challenging, vintage on the left bank. Does that not normally mean that it's not as good on the right bank, or different? Or did you, is it a left bank, right bank vintage, or was it as challenging but successful for you too?
Yes, for us it's quite the same, with less water, I think, because we have only few millimeter of water by the end of August. But when I was there by the end of August and beginning of September, I saw the plants very well, because there is the grape was very good, and there is no stress on the plants, and that is a sign of a good harvest, which starts in the beginning of September, and and there's the 22nd of September. So it was for the millésime vintage 22. It's quite a sign, a lot of two, and but by the end and finally the vintage is very well balanced, and we have a very great. But Paris with as we expect much more the vintage for Petit Village than me. Paris, are you there?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
No?
Oh, sorry, Augustin, we lost you slightly there. I think if you could repeat that.
No, Paris Pierce is in the webinar as well, I think, but and she can explain much more than me for the Petit Village, because I know very well Beauregard, but she's
yeah, I'm here.
Thank you, Paris.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, for us on the right bank, we're at Petit Village, so we're really on the plateau of Pomerol. It was definitely a surprising vintage, I think, like everyone else, in terms of the climate. It was quite dry, but it was more so the dryness than the heat for us that was the impact. But yeah, in the end, everybody was very surprised. They kind of talk about magic a little bit. They don't really know what happened, but we're very happy to present a great vintage for 2022 and very balanced in terms of tannins, and to still have that freshness as well from the fruit was really important. So it's a really interesting vintage in terms of the balance, I think, between the fruit and also different floral characteristics that we can have.
Thank you. So turning Gavin and Rebecca, looking at sort of broadening the picture out a bit with your quite extensive tasting experience across different estates. Where would you, we've spoken and we've heard a bit about the challenges, but also the successes. Do you think there are examples, without necessarily naming names, but where the challenges were not as successfully navigated, whether it was a specific region, specific areas? Was this a vintage where not everyone necessarily was able to come out on top?
I'll let Rebecca go first. I'll be interested in her.
Pressure is on me. I think in some regions, some appellation like Saint-Estèphe, they heavily suffered from hail. Tracy was mentioning hail on the northern part, which means that in addition of the extreme temperatures, hail was an issue. I have to say that on the left bank, maybe Margaux, it's very different from one area to another. But to me, it was the impression. It was in general, it was the vintage of the extreme, and what is in the glass is just exceptional, based on the fact that it was warm and all the different information that Tracy and everyone was saying here. Yeah.
Thanks, Rebecca. And Gavin, obviously you speak with various hats on. I mean, firstly, you as a winemaker, I mean, again, are you echoing the concerns that were raised by our fellow panelists in terms of the challenges you faced, and then maybe with less skin in the game in terms of no one chateau to promote, perhaps you could pinpoint a few specific successes of the vintage which you enjoyed.
Okay, that's quite a broad question there, Tom. I would say, and thank you for mentioning the dancing. I would say generally, as a winemaker, I don't want to have another vintage like that. It was so hot and so dry, and not just, I mean, Bordeaux great vintages, when we think of the great vintages, we think of 9 and 10 and 16, 19, etc. But of course, with the exception of 10 was very dry, and taking the data from 10 and 2022, that it was about as dry. In fact, the stats that I have show that it was dry, but it was much warmer than 2010. And of course, this was a much earlier harvest than 2010, so the wines are very different. But we had the warmest May, we had the warmest June, we had the warmest July, we had the warmest August, taking data from across. I mean, people will have different experiences in different places. I'm taking data from the northern Medoc down to the Grave and across to the Côte, Bourg-Blaye, and then Entre-les-Bains and Saint-Emilion and so on. So taking the data right across the board, you've got a very dry vintage and a very warm vintage. It's been mentioned before about the rain in June. We're getting quite a bit of rain these days in Bordeaux in June. It tends to come in storms, and in this case, it followed a heat wave. You may remember we had a heat wave around June the 18th. I won't bore you too much about the weather, I know, but around the weekend of June the 18th, we had like 42.9 degrees in Biarritz, 41.9 at Cap Ferret in the middle of June. These are just absurd temperatures. And then straight after that, that's when we had the storms from the 20th of June. And that was quite critical for a lot of people, because if you were hit, as Rebecca mentioned, in the northern part of Saint-Estèphe and in various different places, then that could be quite catastrophic. But the rain that everybody else got was hugely beneficial. So you had high rainfall at the end of June. In most places, it varied a lot between different parts of Bordeaux. That was really crucial for refreshing the vines, I think. In terms of why I say I don't want to go through it, because just in case people don't know, we're not allowed to irrigate in Bordeaux. For example, I have a lot of Sauvignon Blanc, and compare that to Marlborough, New Zealand. That's mostly irrigated. Marlborough, New Zealand, we're not allowed to irrigate, so we really are at the mercy of the weather. And I know Fabien has a Sauvignon as well. Delicious Sauvignon it is too. But yeah, it was a very tough call, and the heat wave just carried on. We sort of think, we forget that there was a heat wave in like the second week of September, when everything was right and people were ready to go. And we think of people like, say, Cheval Blanc, they'd picked all their Merlot, before that. They started at the end of August. These are extremes, as has been mentioned. So it was definitely a vintage of extremes. For the wines themselves, tasting right across the board, if it is a great vintage, and I slightly question it, I have to say, if it is a great vintage, then it is the first great vintage that was so uneven, I think, and also pretty low yields in certain places, especially in the northern Medoc and in the Medoc. The yields are, for example, way lower than 2017, but consistently lower than, so I'm talking about Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, Saint-Julien, Margaux. They're consistently lower than, say, the most recent decade and the decade before that. They are well down. And don't forget, that's going to have a big impact on prices. Lots of chateaux reported yields, say, for example, in Pomerol, the neighbors of Petit Village, some very famous ones, 22, 24, 26 hectolitres a hectare, some low, 20s and early 30s for a lot of the top estates across Bordeaux, with the exception, I would point out, of parts of Saint-Emilion. Saint-Emilion had quite good yields, and that's why we're seeing from, say, the clay limestone people, the top estates around the village of Saint-Emilion, you're seeing some pretty good yields. So, for example, you mentioned Canon-Gaffelier, 47 hectolitres a hectare. That's really quite tasty yields, and Stefan von Nieberg is very keen to point that out. But so quite a few properties made good yields there. So it would be the first great vintage with pretty low yields and the vintage of extremes. So when I say great vintages, I'm talking about really the modern vintages. Some people have mentioned things like 82. Well, Christ, look at the yields in 82 compared to what we're seeing in 2022. But just quickly on the wines themselves, I think there are some excellent wines, some fantastic wines, but I'm afraid it's not that easy to pigeonhole this vintage in terms of saying, oh, such and such an appellation, or it's right bank or left bank, whatever. I think it's down to the individual chateaux, the individual terroirs, the decision-making, the ability to adapt, obviously the know-how and the funds and the capability for people to react to things in the vineyard, and then particularly around harvest times and so on. And also in the winemaking. So we're seeing a much lighter touch generally across the board, which is a very positive step, I think. But I'm afraid it comes down to chateau by chateau. And in this, I'd love to say Saint-Julien was great, Pauillac was great, or Saint-Emilion was great, or Pomerol is great. But I really do think and this is going to be good news for the critics, by the way, the ones that you trust, because, put your faith in some of the critics who know what they're talking about, and trust their judgments on the wines. We'll talk about prices a little bit later. Sorry, that's a very long answer, but I don't want a vintage like that again.
No,
it's a really tough
Gavin,
one.
thank you. It's a very good answer, and we can always rely on you to give it to us straight and without any agenda. And I think everyone very much appreciates that, and that overview is extremely useful. Various points you touched on lead me on to my next sort of paired questions, really. Obviously, we've talked about extremes, we've talked about drought, we've talked about heat. It's very clear that the vines themselves and the winemakers are adapting to these changing weather patterns. A number of people who said, oh, well, it's not like 2003 because we are different and the vines are different. But going back to you, first of all, Fabien, in this case, how are the vines adapting to these changing weather? And I'm rolling my next question into that. Are you changing the cepage at all? Are you considering different plantings? What's going on as a result of these extremes?
A large question, because a question of global warming and vinification and all the things. But all the things are linked. And I think that this year we have a good sample of what could be the future. So we have to manage that and to try to adapt the way of driving the vineyards. To give just some example, in Bordeaux, we used to de-leaf the vines very early to put the benches on the sun to help for the ripeness. This year it was the reverse. We have to hide the benches under the leaves to make them shade. Perhaps to do as we do in California, opening the canopy on the top to make more shade too. So we need to protect the benches against the sun because the sun is not a very good friend last year. So we have to adapt the way of doing that. We have to adapt the way of doing the vinification, because if you have more ripeness, because when it's warm, you could have more ripeness. So we have to extract perhaps with more carefully, perhaps not following to extract the whole parts, the whole bunch of tannin you have in the grapes, and try to balance the things, taking perhaps more attention of the freshness of the fruits. We can get them by the shade on the grapes, perhaps take care more on the freshness of the tannin. So we have to imagine and to do different things. We try, and we did that last year, to have another way of building, another idea of building the wine. Last year, learned that we can have many things to do, because before 2022, I thought we have to change the varietal very quickly. We have to plant more Cabernet, to perhaps suppress some Merlot, perhaps use some of the varietal coming from south area, more adapt with the warm. And in fact, last year, the behavior of the vines, Merlot or Cabernet, was very, very good, in the good place, in the good terroir, with deep roots, with a good exchange with the soil, where the vines were able to find some wetness, some water downstairs. In fact, the soil helped very well the vines to go through this very extreme weather condition. So we have this luck to have good terroir and to have the terroir able to help the vines to go through the weather condition. So perhaps we need to change some varietal. Perhaps we have to plant a bit more Cabernet compared to Merlot for our place, in fact, depending on the soil. But we are not in the hurry to change the varietal for me after 2022. So we have to change the way of driving the vineyards. We have to pay more attention to the relationship between the plants, the roots, the soil, to help the vines to go through the weather conditions. The terroir could help the vine to do that. So it's a good thing to know that, because we are focused on soil for the expression of the terroir. But today I know it's more than that. It's the expression of the terroir, it's the special idea of the wine, but at the same time, it's perhaps a unique way to go on with our varietal with the global warming. So I think we have good things to manage in this good card to play, in fact, in this way. but we have to be very good in the viticulture management, because it's really the key of the future of the wine for Bordeaux.
Absolutely, thank you, Fabien. So we won't necessarily be seeing a load of Touriga Nacional and Marcelin being planted in the vine just yet. You know,
I think we have time. You have to
time.
take care of that. You have to pay attention to that and to try to see what could be the result with this varietal, because we don't know what could be in 20 or 25 years. But for the 10 next year, I think we have more time compared to what I thought before 2022.
Mm. And turning to you, Augustin, I think there has certainly been some indications that some estates are preferring later ripening varieties to Merlot. Obviously, this is your key grape over on the right bank in Pomerol. How did the Merlot fare this year? And you know, are you making changes? What's happening over on the right bank?
Not significantly, I think, because we've got 30% of Cabernet Franc, and the Cabernet Franc is quite signature of Beauregard since 30 years, and now since 2014 or 2015, I think we've got a very nice plot of Cabernet Franc, which brings the elegance of and I think Merlot was very, and what is very important is the date of harvest. We bring the Merlot for, as I said just before, from the 2nd to September, and I think Paris, you can perhaps say that for Petit Village it was quite the same. The Merlot was very well ripened.
Yeah, I think that in terms of us, we're definitely not looking at changing any varietals anytime soon, but more so just focusing on when we are replanting this really parcel by parcel and really focusing on the soil that's there. I know with the reconstruction of Beauregard in the last 5 to 10 years, that was more so when they were taking up Cabernet or Merlot and replanting Cabernet. It was due to the soil and really terroir to terroir specific. So at Petit Village, it's kind of the same example. The parcels that we're replanting now for the future are Cabernet Franc and a little bit more Sauvignon where there was Merlot, but it's in terms of they're more suited to that varietal than the Merlot was suited for. So I think it's also in terms of that, and we're really lucky to have very good high quality clay as well. So as long as the roots are there, and I think for us in 2020, the parcels that maybe didn't produce as much in terms of yield were the younger vines, obviously, because their roots aren't as established. So they're not as deep and don't have the opportunity to go looking for that water as deep that's really found in the clay. So for us, that was why a lot of our yields were lower than average, but we were still around 30, 35, but obviously that's still quite low for in general in recent vintages. But for us, it was more so because of these young parcels, and in those young parcels as well, we chose to clean them a little bit earlier and do more of a green harvest to really keep the quality higher and reduce the yield. So.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. It's certainly seeming that older vines, slightly more water retentive soils are going to be very, very favorable for these hotter vintages. Tracy, at Ducroux, how is Bruno and the team adapting to the weather? What's going on here that's making the wines kind of continuing to propel forward?
Well, I think this vintage really revealed the importance of the soil work that has been done over the last decade, particularly. So there's been, not just with us, I think in Bordeaux, across the board, an incredible amount of work in using cover crops and increasing nutrient content, getting better biodiversity in the soils, better aerated soils. And I think those healthier soils, and then using selected grasses throughout the season to help reduce evaporation, and and just increase the overall nutrient content, really helped the vines to better resist the extremes of this season. So I think soil health is not, obviously it was important for the selection for this vintage, but it's something that is a long-term, you can't say what we did this vintage is what worked. It's actually an ongoing, it's like good health. So in the human, so it's just been, we really believe that was really key to a key piece for us. And I think that in terms of, also, once we get out of the vineyards, because everything else was what has been mentioned in terms of, it's a little bit of a season where you didn't want to do too much. We didn't want to do too much leaf thinning. You had to be very, very careful with the leaf thinning, very careful with everything we did. So it's having to almost sit back and then make quick decisions, but intervene very little and be patient. But I think a lot of the other piece of this vintage for us was also once the grapes it was the harvest date itself. So making sure that we were picking the grapes at the actual ideal ripeness. And that for us, we've gotten much more precise. And we've changed our strategy a little bit for the Merlots over the last 3 years. So picking al dente or just at pointe, really when the Merlots are just ripe and not pushing the ripeness at all, has been key, and getting into micro parcel harvesting. So not just harvesting whole parcels, we were really getting into sometimes into the micro parcel and then vinifying that way. So in terms of what was key in the vineyards, I think those would be the main things.
Thank you, Tracy. Gavin, if you don't mind, I'll unless there's anything you want to add to that, I'm going to skip on to the wines themselves. But I don't want to cut you off if there's something you particularly wanted to add on to that particular conversation.
Just very quickly, Tom, what I would say is, and I won't talk about my plan to plant Albarino, which is of course permitted, but just on that, one of the things, maybe the impression we're giving and talking about the heat and so on, one of the surprises was for a lot of people was the quality of the Merlot. So you'd sort of assume in a vintage like this, maybe this would suit the Cabernets better, but the quality of the Merlots in all appellation across the board was extremely high. The other thing that actually went on the ground, and we're sort of painting the picture that it was so roasty, toasty and everything else, but amazingly, and this in many cases, I think, where vineyard managers were saying that the vines adapted to the conditions early on. Now, I just don't quite know how the vines do that, but what I would say is that the look of the vineyards, and I could show you many photos, but the vines looked incredibly healthy in September, and that was remarkable. And really, given the conditions, so we shouldn't assume that it was all sort of a bit better. So I could see why Fabien is saying, for example, they're pausing, but also as on maybe thinking how about plans for varieties and so on, but also as for example, as Tracy said, the precision is absolutely key, picking at exactly the right moment and so on. So, all that decision making. So great varieties, they did okay. They did okay in 2022, that's for sure, in extreme conditions.
Yeah. Can I just add one little piece? Sorry.
No, please. Yeah.
In terms of just one last piece, we have a major replanting project undergoing at Ducru. So the one other thing I would add, we're not looking at necessarily changing our varietals, or we're not looking at that, but in certain plots, making sure that the varietals are better matched to the soils. Merlot was historically used in Bordeaux, or at least for our property, to fatten out in leaner vintages, which is no longer needed, nor the philosophy. So in some places, just giving the terroir that's better suited to Cabernet back to Cabernet, planting it back to Cabernet. But I think also is what we're really looking at is making sure that the clones and the rootstock are really well suited to today's challenges.
Yeah, and thank you, Tracy, and Gavin. There was an interesting quote that I noted down previously from William Kelly's recently published Wine Advocate report on the vintage, which deals very nicely both of your last points, where he says that the fact that vineyards didn't exhibit yellowing leaves of defoliation at the moment of harvest is the most obvious proof that 2022 is very different from 2003, i.e. all of the changes and evolutions that our panel have talked about in the vineyards, the vines themselves, their own viticultural practices has borne fruit. And he goes on to say, and unlike in 2003, Merlot performed superbly in 2022, making an important contribution to blends, demonstrating that this variety has a bright future if farmed intelligently, which, to be honest, is exactly what all of you have just said. So, good. I'd like to talk about the wines now. We've talked about the grapes, the harvest, the vineyards, the viticulture, but the wines themselves now. And I made a comment here, equilibrium is a balance of extremes. I think I made that up a few years ago. So I just say it has been said because it sounded less saying I said this. But Rebecca, in your tasting last week, is that or how fair an assessment is that judgment, would you say?
No, I think again it's back to the fact that everything was complicated, and I think everyone said that. I'm not the winemaker, but what I've tasted in the glass is just how you just at the end of the day you're like, how is it possible? Because all the information you can find them on the internet, and what I was really just to take back Gavin comments, I was really impressed by how the extractions were beautiful. It was so elegant. I mean, for some of them, it was really elegant. And I remember I heard a lot during the week, our extraction are infused, and I found this. The word infused itself is very elegant, and so yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary. So I went to Angelus, and when you arrive there, like they defined each vintage. They have an adjective, and I think it was majestuous or something like that. Just at the entrance, 2022, the majestuous. Yeah, so I think we are going to be very lucky to have the 2022 in our glass, and I can't wait to share with you all.
Gavin, would you be as enthusiastic about the vintage? More caveats? What are your thoughts?
I'd probably have a few more caveats. There were many properties that many estates made really truly great wines, but I didn't get that feeling across the board. And as I said, it wasn't easy by appellation. I think a lot of the established names, made great wines, and so too did many others. But one of the I did talk to a chap who used to do a fantastic report, and he still does the reports, but it's stuck together on bits of paper, and that's Bill Blatch. Many of you will know Bill Blatch. And I had a great tasting of Sauternes with him, and then we looked at the red wines. I said, "What do you think of the reds?" And he said, "Do you know what, Gavin? I just think they're a bit boring." And I don't think he was referring to the top estates, but I did find myself, and I had already found myself getting a little bit bored by some of the wines. And I also found myself, just a personal thing, I wasn't really moved by many of them. I was quite excited by a lot of them, but I wasn't really, when the hairs stand up on the back of your neck. Now, there were some honourable exceptions, and I don't want to necessarily mention them because I don't want to be excused, but there weren't many where I go, oh my God, that is just, amazing. And there were some, many great ones. So I'm not so sure about the greatest vintage ever and all the rest of it. I think great vintages are great vintages across the board, largely. And I think this is you really have to pick them out here, I think. And because what we don't want is for people to have a bottle of 2022 on the table, pay a fortune for it, and be a bit disappointed. If it's supposed to be the greatest. So I think it's a little bit pick and choose carefully, as I've said before. So that's just, and these are many people are making quite big wines still, not intentionally. Even if you just infuse the skins with the juice, you get quite a big wine in 2022. So you have to be careful. So just a word of caution, I would say.
But buyer beware, absolutely. I think with the extremes we're
buyer be careful. Buyer be careful.
Buyer be careful. Buyer be careful. Absolutely. Buy judiciously, and absolutely. Listen to the critics you trust. Many of whom I have to say are as enthusiastic as I've ever seen about a vintage in Bordeaux. But it's very good to have a counter argument that encourages everyone to approach, a little more judiciously. Conscious of time, just a question which we always get asked, and I always ask it, and I know others will want to know. Could we discuss, with relation to the individual chateaus that you are representing, how does this vintage compare to previous vintages? Fabien, turning to you first. Which vintage is it most like, or combination of vintages? And that's for the white, red and the white. I have to say, I have a bottle of the white here, 2017, which I'll be enjoying at dinner. And Tracy, just so you know, I also have a bottle of the 2009 Du Cru as well for my next course. So yeah, but Fabien, how do the vintages compare?
Yeah, just coming back from what Gavin said, is it's not an homogeneous vintage for me, because the drought, especially the drought, was very impacted in the vintage, and so depending on the soil, the ripeness of the grapes and the ripeness of the tannin was not the same everywhere. So I think that people have to select the wine, because you could find very, very great wine for this vintage, and some others are perhaps not so good. But I think this vintage will be great or very good in some places. It could be in Pomerol, it could be in Saint-Emilion, it could be in Pauillac, it could be more or less in all the appellation, but not all the wine are incredibly this year. So we have to select that. This vintage, for me, it's perhaps mixed with something like 2010 for the structures of the tannin and the less and the part of the body as the concentration, and something like perhaps 2020 for the creaminess and for the rawness of the tannin. So for me, it's quite incredible to have in the same wine at the same time quite a very powerful wine, very dense with tannin, but with very smooth tannin, very velvety tannin. So it's really a sort of combination of full ripeness, but with certain, but with a lovely tension and freshness. So it's something it's not so easy to have in Bordeaux, and it's for that it's pretty incredible.
Thank you, Fabien. Tracy, over to you and Du Cru. What are your thoughts?
This is, I find this always a difficult question to answer. And I think part of it is because with all of the innovations or all the modernization that's happened across Bordeaux in general, we have way more purity and clarity than we did in the 10. So, and I think there's just much more the texture of the tannins and the purity of the fruit is improving all of the time. So it's always difficult to make those comparisons. I think you look to any of the hot and dry vintages would be the best way to go. And it is certainly a vintage with a lot of tannin. So I think the 20, I would have to agree, that's probably the closest for us would be the 20, but it's got even more firm structure and more concentration. And I think it's got that verve of freshness that's like this almost like a vein of salinity that goes through it that reminds me more of the 16 somewhere. But it's still unique. It's unique in its presentation. It's hard to make comparisons.
Salinity is a good word. Salinity came up in my notes quite a lot. Salinity is a feature here in a good way.
Yeah.
Salinity is always, that's sapidità, as the Italians have it, frankly, is always to be looked for in just about any wine. Moving over to the right bank, Augustin and Paris, if you'd like to comment as well, Beauregard and Petit Village. How do the wines compare?
I could say for Beauregard something, because we bought the property in 2014 with the partnership, a Katia family, friend of us. And Vincent Priou, who was in charge of the property since 1991, said for him, is one of the best vintage. And compared to 1998, we served at last party in Beauregard in Double Magnum. It was one of the great vintage in Pomerol for the 24-30 last year in Provence. It was one of the best. And he said the second vintage, which could be compared in the quality of the grape, the quality of the berry, it's 2010. But I think with the precision we bring since 2015 to 2022 should be one of the best he done. So what can I say? So Paris, what do you think about Petit Village?
Yeah, I think in terms of if you have to compare it to a vintage, obviously it is quite unique. I think Fabien's description was really pretty spot on in terms of tannins and freshness and things like that. But for a vintage that was also quite early and warm was 2003. But again, we just have so much more control and precision in the vineyard all year round and in the cellar as well to have more gentle extraction and the really precise picking points and really helping the vine in the vineyard along with biodiversity and things like that, that it allows us to have a product that is a lot more precise itself and very velvety and so forth on the tannins as well, and freshness too. So
yeah,
because for Petit Village we start a new story in 2020 for the property, and we do a better selection. We bring all the stuff from Beauregard and the Haut to Petit Village, and we would like to increase the quality of the wine, as we've done for Beauregard since 2015. So it's a new story. So it's very difficult to compare, but
just in terms of water,
yeah, absolutely. No, that's entirely fair enough. And Rebecca and then Gavin, again, some quick sort of final thoughts about having again tasted extensively. Where do you find your notes fitting most into previous vintages that you've tried? Rebecca, where would you say we're looking at?
Yes, I think just thinking about, I don't know who mentioned 2016, but I feel I feel that it's as good to me. It's as good or even better than 16. 19 was a good vintage, but 16 was quite generous. But here, I think in terms of techniques, in terms of winemaking techniques, and of course the condition of the vintage, I think we reached a higher level in terms of complexity and elegance. Yeah.
Okay. Gavin, over to you.
Actually, I was just thinking, because 2003 has been mentioned quite a lot, and there was one thing that was quite similar with 2003, apart from heat and so on, was I remember tasting L'Herve Barton and Langot with Anthony Barton in 2004, and he said there were two characteristics of the harvest in 2003. We had very small berries and even smaller berries, which I think is his way of saying, I'm going to be putting the price up. But so small berries was quite a thing. I don't think the small berries of 03 were familiar. I agree with the 2010, Fabien, with 2010 in much of the sort of the maturity, the tannins and so on. But I think then he's absolutely right. If you then add a bit of a sort of solar vintage like 2020, maybe there's a bit, there's definitely a sort of a sunny feel to it, but I would couch. I would just to be a little bit careful that it's not. If everyone's going into this vintage thinking this is going to be like 2010, but sunnier, brighter sort of cashmere tannins and all the rest of it. I'd just be a little bit careful, as I've said before, from Château to Château. There's some amazing wines, and if someone said this is like a combination between my 2010 and 2016 with a dash of 2020 or 2018 sunshine, then they may well be right. But the Bordelais are good salespeople.
Very good, Gavin. Thank you. That's as ever useful advice. Conscious of time, I just wanted to see if we had any questions from our attendees. We've answered some of the ones in the chat function about yield. Did anyone want to either just put a question in chat or just unmute yourself and ask our panel collectively or individually anything in particular? If not, I do have a question myself, but I'm just I want to give other people a chance to ask any burning questions.
I've got a question, Tom. That's all right. And
yeah, please, James.
I want to extend, I guess, to any or all of the panel, given the differences in appellations that you all work in. But we've spoken a lot today about work in the vineyards and the vines themselves adapting to the heat. I'm just wondering, what might be happening in the winery itself with different fermentations, and we've touched on that infusion that you mentioned, Rebecca, and Paris, you mentioned the greater control that we've seen in these hot vintages in the past. So what have we learned from those vintages, and what's happening now in the winery itself to help control these what are turning into be more frequently hotter vintages? So I guess I'll open it up to whoever wants to go first.
Firstly, what I would say, just don't know if could you hear me on this?
Yeah.
What I would say on this, don't forget, there's been the most, if we go back to like 2003, there's just been the most enormous investment in wineries for a start, let alone the kit, the equipment in the vineyards and so on. So the wineries, I mean, just the number of new wineries, and how they have the capacity to handle the fruit in different ways. So I mean, just almost pick anyone. There's not many people making, very few people making wine in those same conditions. And obviously we've seen a huge amount of investment just in the last decade, new wineries and so on. Obviously it's the gentler touch, and we mustn't forget that there was Robert Parker stopped writing stopped doing the Primeurs in 2012. So we're very much in a post-Parker era. We've got the journalists, generally the critics, like the sort of the more elegant, delicious wines. So no one is thinking maybe I need to sort of chase the sort of extraction here, maybe I need to chase the structure and so on and so forth. So we're seeing much more elegant wines, and there are so many ways you could do that in the winery. Just the very simple thing. I mean, certainly, just take at Fabien at Smith Lafitte, they're doing things completely, in a different style to, they've learned so much, and every winery is the same. At Ducru, they're all the same. They're all doing things more gently. So you're not doing the sort of the pump overs and things that you used to maybe in the past, or the delistage, the rack and return and all these different things. And so the extraction is much gentler, let alone the reception of the fruit and the sorting and the attention to detail with that across just the whole thing is. And if there is maybe a downside, some of the wines are sometimes too precise. So that's a risk that you just get so precise the terroir doesn't come through. Anyway.
Thank you, Gavin. Fabien, you're poised to speak. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with Gavin, because in fact, I think that in Bordeaux in the past, we didn't get the same ripeness. And so we need to extract with more activity, with more deepness to try to have something in the wine. And we know that in this kind of wine, the tannin was a bit more rustic. And after today, we know that with more ripeness, we need to do less things to have enough body and enough structures to make a balanced wine. And I feel that now we can improve the quality of the wine with the idea of making balanced wine, in fact. So it's not a concourse, it's not a competition for concentration of tannin or for high level of IPT. It's more a question of global balance. And we had two wonderful vintage for that. 21, which was difficult to find the rightness. So we have to manage to aim for the rightness, to aim for picking late, to try to give more roundness and more smoothness to the wine, because Mother Nature gives us the freshness. And this 22, Mother Nature gives us the body, the concentration, the power. So we have to find and to aim for freshness and for balance. So I think that our job now is to try to manage to find the balance of each vintage and to try to perhaps extract less, but feeling more balance in the wine and more complexity and more purity. So it's really another way of thinking the wine, another way of breathing the wine. And for the white, it's the same story with more precision, because the white is really on the edge of the things, and you have to be always in an idea of balance, even if you have the ripeness and the smoothness.
Yeah.
And I would just add to that, with all the new technology we have put in the wineries and in the cellars, the idea, I think there's also a lot more education and more time spent tasting, thinking, and using the knowledge combined with intuition to make decisions. So instead of just putting in a program for the maceration, we start with one tank and we look to see how it behaves, and then we really kind of set the program from there, and then we fine tune each tank, and that's gotten much more time on the reflection piece on each of and how we go about it tank by tank.
Yeah. Thank you, Fabien. Thank you, Tracy. Augustin and Paris as well. Any final thoughts that you'd like to add on that front?
I think that they explained a lot, the best part of it. I think it's just investment again in the vineyard to be more precise and delicate when needed. Obviously, we've had more investments at Petit Village in the last 3 years, with the Moulin family being present since then, and just seeing the development in the last 3 years, just within precision and more precise selection, and obviously just using technology. But it's not just the technology either; it's how we're using it and taking advantage of it, and also how that's changing vintage to vintage as well. So it's interesting to see it progress and change as well, and adapt to every year.
Thank you. Augustin?
Yes, and for Beauregard, we can say with Fabien that we do a complete refurbish of the vat and the cellar for the vintage 2015. And we start as well with the gravity and a better selection. That's we increase the quality of the wine. That's why since this vintage, we increase vintage after receive the quality of the wine. Yeah.
Thanks very much, panel. I'm conscious of the time, and I know some people need to head off. There was one question here which I knew we wouldn't escape from. So thank you, Anup. Obviously, pricing, and Anup's question here was thoughts about pricing in the current global situation. Is there a compelling reason to buy?
Gavin's pouring himself a drink.
Is there a compelling reason to buy these wines en primeur if pricing goes up? Compared to the recent solar triumphant of years. So here we go. The big question: why should we be buying the wines en primeur? Maybe I could start with you, Augustin.
Yes, for Petit Village, the production is divided by two since 2020. So there is not enough for the market, but. And the quality was so good that I think it's a good deal to buy in Primeur. And for Burger, I think we increase the quality as I explained, but 2022 should be a good deal because it's one of the best that we have never done in Burger. So that's the two arguments to convince your consumer to buy those two Château. I think
high quality, low quantity. Fabien, would you echo that at Smith Haut Lafitte?
Yes, we have a small quantity this year. We have a very high quality, and I think that the price will improve during the 2 next years. So it stay a good opportunity to buy now for the value and for the quality of the wine, because I think this kind of vintage, we have to have them in the cave. So I think it's a good thing to do.
And Tracy, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, the same story to Cru, the demand is higher than the supply. So I don't think, in terms of, and it's a wine that every vintage gains value. So and I think Bordeaux in general, for the top Château, it gains value. But I think that it's important to come back to Gavin's points. And I think this is a question that's really, I think you have to ask yourself, why are you buying? Is it to consume it, or is it to hold it and hope that you gain value? And then it's really Château by Château. And I think that it's going to depend on what the release prices are, what the quality of the particular wine that you're looking at, or wines that you're looking at. So I think it's it has to be an educated purchase.
Yeah, I think one thing we might encourage the consumers to consider is that if you look at the trajectory of Bordeaux pricing from 2018, where there was a very conscious, I think, desire to continue moving the price up, and then 2019, the pandemic vintage saw what perhaps we thought might be a reset, but in fact was more of a blip. And then 2020 and 21 have seen prices largely sort of stabilize. When you look by comparison at the ever escalating prices of Burgundy in a very small vintage like 2021 we've just seen, with price increases 20-30% up, I think the standard grumbling, which as a member of the trade we do, of course, we grumble about the increased prices in Bordeaux. It doesn't seem unreasonable or lacking in merit to see why we would be looking at an increase this year. So that would be my reflection on that. Rebecca and Gavin, just finally rounding up on that question of buying En Primeur, your thoughts?
Okay.
Gavin, go first, because I went first before.
Okay.
And we need to finish on a positive note, so
Yeah. I think the top wines are going to be very expensive. Just looking at the mere facts of, and there's been already mention of smaller yields, but without doubt, we're seeing smaller yields in the Northern Medoc, which is a sort of engine room of En Primeur. So a lot of people had smaller yields. There are some people still there that make a decent amount of wine, but I do think that's what I think there's going to be wines to buy. Personally, I think the top wines are going to be sort of, they were all the top wines are beyond me anyway, but the sort of nearly top wines, they're going to be so expensive. If I was a Château owner, I'd be, demand, as Tracy was saying, demand far outstrips supply for some of these wines. So it wouldn't surprise me to see very expensive wines, but that still means there's an awful lot of other stuff. If you think of Bordeaux as a sort of pyramid, and you've got the very top stuff, and then there's that sort of wedge in that middle near the top, where I think there's going to be still some excellent values to be had. Probably not the most famous names, but many in the sort of hundreds of pounds a case of 12, rather than the sort of thousands of pounds a case. And I think there's going to be, I still think there's going to be some value there. And there are, if those wines are in short supply, that is a very good reason to buy En Primeur. Or if you want, if you like your Magnums or big formats, or if you just want to secure the stock, if you've got the money, I think this is a great vintage to buy En Primeur. But prices, prices are going to go. I mean, some people say 10 to 20%. Are you kidding? It's gonna be very expensive for the top stuff. But there's some really good wines in the middle tier, and I've got my eye on a dozen. And if anybody wants to send me a direct message on Twitter, Gavin @Gavin Quinney, I'll give you my list of 10 that I'll keep an eye on. or maybe 20 that I'll keep.
Excellent. I think that's I'll be
Not investment wine.
I'll be sending that to you.
These are not. These are drinking wines. For me, this is going to be buy the drinking wines, and I don't mean the cheap stuff. Don't forget as well. I think there's a limit to how far down you go with En Primeur, because there is no protocol, there is no rules about the samples we tasted and so on. So I think you have to say there is a limit to how far down you go. And I have got a cellar full of things that I tasted En Primeur, which may be not quite what I got in the cellar, that have been sitting there from the 2000 vintage, the 2005 vintage, the 2010 vintage. And so still go for the quality, but at the right point.
Thank you, Gavin. And finally, a few last words from you, Rebecca. Given your position as buyer for a wine business which wants to sell a lot of En Primeur, there's no bias there. But final thoughts on why we should be excited about the vintage.
Well, as we spoke about it for 1 hour, and I think everyone saw my position regarding the vintage, quite positive. It's a basic principle of economy of supply and demand. So because the production is lower, we spoke about the yield, they were lower. I think they're going to be a higher demand. And so I would certainly invest in that vintage. And hopefully everyone around that Zoom will get access in priority to the top Château. Not necessarily the first grows, but I'm thinking about in general. So yes, because the demand will be higher than the supply, then yes, you should invest. And number one. Number two, also be mindful that this vintage, there won't be that many second wines because the quality was, according to the owners and the winemakers, the quality was that exceptional that, so I'm not sure if it's marketing or not, but I certainly believe that when you have a beautiful quality, you don't really want to put it in a second wine. So it doesn't mean that there'll be more first wines, but it will be different. And lastly, the only thing I wanted to add on the technology and the fact that there's more scientific approach and science in general is helping to make more precise wines, that I think it's a good idea, so that we go with development and with our time with science. I think I will share something that Daniel Catiard from Smith Lafitte said at the Fête du Bon Temps. So last week there was to close the En Primeur week. There's been a beautiful party at Smith Lafitte, and he said wine is not artificial intelligence. So that's true that technology is helping, but we still need to keep in mind that wine is still an agricultural product, and we depend on the weather and the environment. So hopefully you will share the wine, but also on an investment point of view, I think it's a good way to invest, but also a good vintage to share with friends and family.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Yes, we can't forget the importance of the human element and the magic that Bordeaux En Primeur always creates. Well, I'll draw things to a close now. Thank you so much to our panel. Thank you to Tracy and Augustin. Thank you, Paris, as well, for your interjections. Fabien, thank you very much indeed. Gavin, always a pleasure. Thank you to our attendees this evening. I know some of you had to drop off. We will, as I mentioned, we've recorded this, so we'll be sending this round. I think it's been fascinating. I hope you agree. I wish you all a lovely evening, and we're looking forward to an exciting En Primeur campaign. Thank you very much. Bye.